but I think it's need to be mentioned that in textile items, Pakistan, what I feel that the what are the high value added, value added items. In one high value item, I feel that the ready-made garments, and I also consider knitwear in that. It's account only less than 30% of the total textile exports. So we can have an idea that Pakistan largely exports low value added items in textiles. So this is basically a small introduction about the structure of the economy. With that, I now come to the labor force. These are the labor force participation rates. Before I go on to labor force, I first would like to mention that in the labor force, we have defined labor force, the population, the labor force survey, the data, entire data has been collected from labor force survey. The labor force survey defined labor force as population 10 years and above. But for our analysis, we have taken the population 15 years and above because we feel that the population in the age bracket 10 to 14 years is child labor, and according to the ILO, according to ILO as a definition recommended by the ILO, we have excluded that age bracket, which is 10 to 14, and considered the population 15 plus as a labor force in our analysis. So given that, what are the participation rates we look at? The participation rate basically is the labor force participation rate is the total labor force as a percentage of total population of that respective age. Is that defined participation rate? So we see that the labor force participation rate of male has declined from 88.5 to 82.4%, and this could be because of the male migration to to abroad. And the female participation rate, we see that is increased remarkably from 9.9% to 21.7%. So what these statistics show that basically the gender gap seems narrowing, but if we look at the economically active and the economically inactive population, it is still repressing that we see that 78% of the female are still out of the labor force compared to 17.6% of male. Now the next slide shows the distribution. Now here the next few slides will discuss about the structure of the employment. And in the structure of the employment, I will look at the employment by sector, the employment by employment status, and the employment by occupation. So these three types of employment gives us the structure, basically how the male and female are located in the labor market. So this slide shows us the structure by sector, the male and female. We look at this, that the share of agriculture, if we see agriculture, forestry and hunting, the share of male in agriculture has been declining from 43.9% to 35%. But if you look at the same thing in the female, it's alarming that if you see that it's increased from 65.7% to 73.8%. So keep in mind that the share of agriculture, as we saw in the earlier slide, that the share of agriculture has been declining in Pakistan, and the share of male employment is moving with the same line, but the share of female employment in agriculture is increasing. The other obvious, the important thing which emerged from this table is that the if we see the male employment, is it spread across different sectors. But you look at the female employment, you will find the female employment is largely concentrated in three sectors. Agriculture, where the majority lies, 73.8%. Then we have manufacturing sector, which is 11.9%. And then we have community, social and personal services, which is again 11.5%. So these are primarily the main three sectors where the entire majority of the food, more than I think 95% or something like that, they all lie in these three sectors. Now the next slide is related to the occupational categories. So instead of going to the all sectors and looking what are the occupation, what I did, I just took the three sectors from the earlier slide where we saw that the concentration of female, that is agriculture, forestry, hunting, manufacturing, community, social and personal services. So we have found in the earlier slide that these were the three main sectors. The female employment was concentrated, and then I looked upon the occupational categories. So what I have found in that, in the book, I have given a table where you can see the male and female distribution by occupation, but here I have just given the female, just to show you that female employment, if we look in this sector-wise, all the occupational categories, there are only 4 categories where female employment is concentrated. In agriculture, we see that 90% of the female are skilled agricultural and fishery workers. In manufacturing, we see that more than 95% female are craft and related workers. And in community and social services, we see that females are technician and associate professionals. So let me clear also one thing here, that in technician and associate professionals, we have professions like nursing, pre and primary level less qualified teachers, and midwives, computer related works, things, these type of occupations come in technician, associate professionals. So this is basically the employment structures across different sectors and what are the occupation in these 3 sectors. The next slide, we look at the employment status. The employment status of female by sector, again, I took only the 3 sectors where it was concentrated. The labor force survey defined the employment status by 4 categories, giving 4 categories: self-employed, unpaid family helpers, employees, and employers. So what we see that, I have also not given that in the slide, but it's in the report, that of the total employed female, the labor force show that 63% of the total employed, 63% are unpaid family helpers. So that intended me to look that in which sector the females are lying. Then I just looked, the data then shows that in the agriculture, 94%, all the unpaid family helpers, among all them, all the 63%, 94% are associated with the agriculture sector. Then of the total labor force, 23% are employee, and among these employees, majority, they are in 25% are in agriculture, 27% are in manufacturing, and the large part is in the community and personal services. Then 14% of total female employment is self-employed, and of these 14%, 62% are associated with the agriculture sector. Again, we see there only less than 0.1% of the female are employers, and they lie in manufacturing, community, and personal services. So this has given us an idea that how the employment, female employment particularly, is spread across different sectors, different occupational groups, and by status of employment. The next slide is to look at the education, level of education of the employed, the labor force. Again, this table shows male and female. I have divided the entire educational categories into 5 main categories: illiterate, below primary, primary, matriculation, intermediate, and degree. So it is again, it is in a way commendable that illiterate in both male and female, the share of employed, those who are illiterate is declining. In male, it is declining from 55% to 37%, and in case of female, it has declined from 82% to 76%, but it is still needs to be considered. Think that it's 76% of the female are still illiterate in the labor force of Pakistan. Now 31% of the employed males have acquired education at least up to primary level. But if we see that the education of female up to primary level, only 11% of the female are those who have acquired education at least up to primary level. Then if you look at the degree level, there are only 4% of the female in the total female labor force who have education up to degree level. In that degree level, we have graduation, post-graduation, masters, we have doctors, professionals, and all. the next slide, in the next slide I again look at how this level of education is spread among different sectors. If I want to know that where are these illiterate women working. So this slide shows me that 85% of all the illiterate, more 86% of all illiterate female, they are associated with the agriculture sector. And if you say agriculture, I mean that agriculture crop producing sector, the livestock. So primarily studies have shown that in our agriculture sector, which accounts takes livestock and cropping sector, majority of the females are associated with the livestock sector. Since livestock is every family they have and these type of cattle in the house, and it's the duty of the female to look after the animals. So majority of these as a family worker, they work in the livestock. So now what is the then I look the below primary education. Again, majority of them are associated with the agriculture sector. Then if you look at the manufacturing sector, 30%, 23% in the manufacturing sector are below primary, 30% are educated up to primary, and 22% are educated up to matriculation. Only 10%, nearly up to 10% in the manufacturing sector are professional graduates. And in the community in personal services, we say that the graduate and above and professional graduate, they all largely lies in these community and social and personal services. Now, so with that thing in mind, I just went to compute next slide. Look at how the employment and growth in the production and the growth in the employment, how they are. I mean, is there anything that the way the employment is growing, the way the production is growing? The first I look at the total GDP, the entire production, the entire output produced in the economy. Then I got surprised when I looked at in the 70s, the GDP growth rate on average was 5%, whereas if you look at the female employment or the male employment, it was 8.6%. In the next decade, 80s, the GDP growth rate increased to 6.1%, but the employment was declined. Female employment and male both declined to 2.7 and 2%. Then in the 90s, the GDP declined, but the employment, you see, it increased. And in the 2000, the GDP increased and the employment growth also increased. Then I went on looking at the GDP growth by composing it into three sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, and services. Then I had found that in the 90s, when female employment increases to 4.8%, there was a slight increase in the agriculture growth. And in the 2000, the manufacturing growth was 8.9% and the female growth in female employment was 8.2%. So with having that entire frame in my mind, the structure of the economy, the structure of the employment, I then went to find the extent of the relationship of these variables and the labor force participation rate. So these are the variables that I took. The trade liberalization, I captured it with, according to the literature, trade liberalization is captured generally by trade as a ratio to GDP. So I use the same measure here. The commodity concentration in exports, agriculture and manufacturing production, literacy rate, child-women ratio, and overseas labor migration. So what I have found, and these are the elasticities, mean this is the percentage changes. So what does this mean? Trade liberalization, the elasticity is 0.2. All the elasticities number with the steric signs shows that they are statistically significant. What I've found that 1% increase in trade liberalization brings only 0.2% increase in female participation in the labor force. So what my analysis shows that although trade liberalization has contributed in increasing female participation rate, but the magnitude to which they increase is very small, it's 0.2%. Because I don't say that the trade liberalization has not benefited women. Of course it has benefited, but the benefits were restricted only to those who were highly qualified, those who have some sort of skilled, and those who were associated with the sectors that were more close to that had the more direct effects of liberalization. So I feel that they have benefited, but the benefit was very limited. Then I went to commodity concentration. We have seen into the earlier slide that Pakistan exports are largely concentrated to the textile sector. So what happens if the exports or the production is concentrated to a sector, then a highly risk is associated with that production, because if any external or internal shock negatively affect that production, it then consequently affect the employment. And what happens in case of male and female and Pakistan, that when this negatively affect employment, then women are the first who get the more vulnerable, who get affected with these external or internal shocks, because they are less qualified and they are certain specific sectors where they work. Because if they are laid off from some sectors, it's very difficult for them to find another sector, and it takes time in switching from one job to another. And then I have found agriculture and manufacturing. First I tried it by taking the entire GDP, but it didn't work out. And given the data and the growth rates, I have found that agriculture and manufacturing output affects largely. It's because if the production in agriculture and manufacturing sector increases by 1%, then the female participation rate increases by 0.44%. And the another thing which I have found, the literacy rate. So again, its elasticity is very low, 0.25. It means that the entire educational, there is a link, of course. Literacy rate positively affect higher literacy, higher chances to be in the labor force participation, but it's extremely weak in case of Pakistan. The another important thing which I have found, that the child-women ratio. This came out very insignificant. Child-labor ratio is mean that I have taken the population of children 0 to 9 or 10 years something, and the child-bearing age of females from 20 to 44. And I took the ratio of that and then tested it to the labor force participation rate and found it insignificant. Then I probed this further by looking at the data in the labor force, and what I have found there, that in the child-bearing age, women are, even in that age, women are working. Generally, what sort of experience we see in other countries, that during the child-bearing age, the participation rate of female declines. So it's sort of a U-shaped curve we see. But in case of Pakistan, it does not see any trends. In sometimes you say inverted U. So if the child, it means that female in Pakistan are working even in the child-bearing age, and particularly in the rural areas. So in the report, I have given the graphs of this thing, but not shown in this. So with that thing, what conclusion I drew with this? Female employment is concentrated in agriculture, manufacturing, and community and social services sector. In manufacturing sector, female are engaged mainly in the apparel industry. The studies of my analysis also show that largely female are concentrated in apparel industry, because in textile, in the cloth production and yarn production, it's highly mechanized, and female usually don't attain that type of skill to run those machines. Then men prefer to get employment in sectors other than agriculture, and women are substituting them in agriculture sector and working as unpaid family helpers. The effect of trade liberalization continues to be limited on female participation in the labor force, as there are certain specific sectors where they work, they are less qualified and have less technical skills. Commodity concentration affects female participation negatively, as any risk to exports tends to affect the employment of the vulnerable group largely. And growth in agriculture and manufacturing sector contributes in enhancing the female participation in the labor force. The link between education and employment, though positive, but is weak. Now, factor continues to increase. So what I have found, that although I run the entire model, entire regression, but all of my elasticities, they were less than 0.5. So in the end, I realized that there are some factors which hard to capture them in a model. And I then feel that there are factors that impede greater participation of female are related to socio-cultural environment of Pakistan and their limited mobility, female limited mobility. And I also have some conclusion in the end, the recommendation in the end, that given the concentration of women in rural activities, policies for increasing agriculture growth, especially in livestock and other female labor-intensive activities are important. Industrial growth that lead to support the export growth needs to be enhanced, particularly in items like garments, leather, jewelry, sports goods, etc., where females generally work. The export of apparel items need to be promoted through greater access to international markets and by enhancing the competitiveness, both price and quality. The other is the issue of unpaid family helpers. I feel it needs to be addressed by removing the gender bias in land ownership, because they are largely exist in the urban rural areas, in the agriculture sector, where their gender bias exists in the land ownership, which limits living capacity to get financial benefits of their labor. Then I have I will mention that the nature of the vulnerability and women more competitive is also important, and it's important to ensure women's educational gains. Then there is a need to address the problems of labor market insecurity, low pay, and gender discrimination in the labor informal employment. And the other thing which I would like to mention also is the role of cottage and small scale industries, because the experience has shown that they have played a greater role in creating female employment and increasing exportable surpluses. So I feel that since cottage and small industries provide flexible hours, and appropriate measures need to be taken to enhance the development of these industries. To encourage small businesses run by women entrepreneurs, smart credit needs to be mainstreamed by removing the impediments in obtaining small loans. And finally, I would like also mention that the formulation of trade and labor policy policies needs to be done in consultation with representatives of women workers. So to conclude, I would say that there is a need for the formulation and implementation of comprehensive policy measures for the elimination of all types of discrimination, which is essential to encourage more women in paid labor force, and would consequently have produced exportable surplus, where relatively large portion of employed female can attain the benefits of paid utilization. So with that, I end my presentation. Thank you very much.
I hope I got it right. And Councillor Development, Terry. Chairman Javed Jabbar, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Let me say that since the two formal reviewers of this very excellent work are not here today, Dr. Nusrat Ahmed and Dr. Parvez Tahir, I thought if you allow me, I'll perform the function of a kind of a reviewer, rather than as somebody who has a role in the management of SPDC. And I have really not been intimately involved in this research. On the study of education and health and gender disaggregation, I'd like to give you a very simple interpretation of how I see the findings. There's some very interesting results, and of course, economists tend to use all sorts of technical jargon, so please forgive us. I'll try and avoid that jargon. The basic conclusion, I think, that is being reached by that study is that when you look at 1998-99, which is the fag end of the so-called democratic period, and then go look at 2004-05, which in some sense is the peak of the military dispensation. I think what is interesting is to see what is the difference, if any, in priorities. And if you look at those numbers, I see some very important differences. The first is that during the tenure of the military government, what really happened, it seems, is that the priority in education shifted from primary and secondary education towards tertiary education. And there was, no doubt, a very sizable expansion in enrollment in institutions of higher education during this period, and allocations increased very rapidly. Now, what was the implication of that? The implication, it turns out, interestingly, is that this was actually not a pro-poor policy. It was not pro-poor in the sense that children from poor families hardly ever get to university or college in Pakistan. So this was a policy which favored, if anything, the urban middle class. But it had an interesting side consequence, and that is that in public universities in Pakistan, by and large, the pattern is, you'll be surprised, as far back as the mid-90s when I was the Vice Chancellor of Karachi University, we had 54% of enrollment of women in public universities. And that is truly a contradiction. I mean, as a PhD student at Stanford, the enrollment of women at Stanford was hardly 25%. And in a third world so-called Muslim country, in public universities, we have a majority of women. Now it's 70-30. So this policy followed by the military government certainly was not pro-poor, but coincidentally perhaps was pro-women, in the sense that due to the expansion in the number of educational institutions of colleges and universities, more women from poorer families and middle-class families were able to enroll. So that, I think, is one very important finding. However, it is very clear to me that given a nation where half the population is still more or less illiterate, where an even higher proportion of women are illiterate, it's extremely important that we continue to preserve our basic priorities towards primary and secondary education. And I think this move towards higher education was premature. It came at a time when the underlying base was not strong enough. And those of us who teach at the university level have this problem that the quality of students now entering universities has declined. And it has declined because we have not focused on quality of education at the secondary and primary level. So irrespective of what we do, I would like to think that now that we have a democratic dispensation once again, that the priority will shift to rural education, will shift back to primary and secondary education, and will focus more on gender. The big problem we have had in the past has been the issue to me, which the research probably has not adequately addressed, is in the context of education of women, is it really an issue of access? Or is it the impediment imposed by cultural values? I mean, we may have a school in a village for girls, but will they necessarily go, depending upon the cultural and social attitudes of families? So we need to somehow or the other develop a research tool to untangle whether the problem with girls' enrollment being so low is a problem on the supply side, more schools, more teachers, or is it a problem on the demand side, a bias against female education? On the very important and very interesting study on the gender implications of the trade liberalization process in Pakistan, I was particularly interested, having had some role to play in the actual implementation of this process of trade liberalization way back in the early 90s when I had some role to play in the government. And I must profess, and I speak with all sincerity, and accept that we probably, at least I will, made a mistake. And Pakistan has not, it seems to me, looking back over the last 10 to 15 years, got the benefits of trade liberalization that we would have liked to have received. Unfortunately, Pakistan has not gained from liberalization of the kind that, say, for instance, more recently, India has. And I think there is a very important reason why this liberalization of Pakistan has failed. You see, what we were trying to do in the early 90s, and I was then for some time in charge of the Ministry of Commerce, we were trying to shift the signals in the economy away from import substitution towards export promotion, which made eminent sense because it would be creating more demand for labor, it would open up markets for us, and at that time, this seemed to be exactly the right thing to do. But this reallocation of resources in the economy was predicated on the assumption that private investors would respond. Unfortunately, due to all kinds of reasons, particularly instability in the political regime during the 90s, private investment was very shy. So we did not get the kind of a response to liberalization that we would have liked to have seen. And of course, come the last decade, the decade starting in the year 2000, there has been further liberalization, but we still have not got the gains that we would have liked to have received. What we have seen, however, is one lesson which UNCTAD taught us a long time ago, which we ignored. And that is that in the initial response to trade liberalization, what happens is imports peak, exports don't grow. Because you open up and you get a flood of imports. And this is exactly